All right. Yeah. We'll just start right away here. Welcome to the Standing Committee of Social Development, Bill 32, Naturopaths Professional Status Amendment Act. Before we start, Mr. Bull, will you open up with a prayer, please?
Much, Mr. Chairman, Tanapa Yastiha, Tanyatia, Yastiha, John Dinino, Quanzin, no Haldestia. It's another you saw at the light out, John Minister, Health and Social Service, how you'll the do a naturally on see do no at least for Papa Celia has here, Papa like that. Merci. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Welcome to our meeting in the Standing Committee of Social Development. Can I have somebody to accept the agenda that is in front of us? It's one item, and it's public hearing on Bill 32, Naturopath Professional Standards Amendment Act. Moved by Mr. Bolio, seconder by Mr. Blake. All in favor? Is there any conflict of interest? Declare. Seeing none. At this point in time, I would like the members to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Good evening, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta. Welcome.
I'm Tom Bolio, MLA for Tuneda and Willowday.
Good evening. My name is Michael Nadley, MLA for Decho.
Julie Green, Yellowknife Center. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Shane Thompson from the Henday. On my left, I'll just make sure. Yeah, my left there. Yeah, that's it. Miss Holland, Alyssa Holland, and she's our lawyer, law clerk. Pardon me. The lady beside me is Megan Welsh. She's our policy analyst, and the lady on my right is Miss Gail Bennett again. Again.
It's getting old.
Thought you retired like 4 times.
5 times now, but
5 times.
but yeah. Mr. Abernathy, at this point in time, would you be willing to introduce your staff and proceed with any opening comments should you wish?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Bill 32, the Naturopathic Profession Statutes Amendment Act. There are a number of people joining me here today. Bruce Cooper, the Deputy Minister. On the right, we have Christina Brownlee, who is Legislative Counsel, and Gary Toft, who is the Director of Policy, Legislation, and Communications. Behind me, I have a few other people. Colette Perry, who is the Manager of Policy and Legislation. Heather Ruptash, who is the Senior Policy Advisor who worked on this file, and Susan Laramie, who is my Ministerial Special Advisor. Mr. Chair, as you know, the Legislative Assembly passed the Health and Social Services Professions Act to enable the Government of the Northwest Territories to regulate numerous professions under one legislative framework, and later amended that legislation to strengthen the competency requirements for professions. Work has been underway to draft professional regulations to bring Health and Social Services Professions Act into force. This includes regulations for 4 groups of professions: emergency medical service providers, naturopathic practitioners, licensed practical nurses, as well as psychologists. We expect that the Health and Social Services Profession Act will come into force later this year with the regulations of emergency medical service providers, followed by naturopathic practitioners, and both will be newly regulated professions. Some members may recall that naturopathic practitioners were added to the list of professions to be regulated under the Health and Social Services Act in February of 2014. This decision was supported by requests from MLAs, members of the profession, and by the 17th Legislative Assembly's Standing Committee on Social Programs. Regulated profession helps ensure the safety of the public as it establishes rules and requirements for how a profession must train, practice, and conduct themselves. Since naturopathic practitioners are not currently regulated in the NWT, there are very few parameters for how the profession can practice. Once regulated, naturopathic practitioners would be subject to a complaints and discipline process if a patient or a member of the public or another professional or the complaints officers files a complaint. Prior to bringing these regulations into force, consequential amendments must be made to the Medical Professions Act, the Pharmacy Act, and the Public Health Act. The regulations do not have the authority to amend or repeal an existing act, and the department's putting forward this bill that's in front of you to address the consequential amendments required by the new naturopathic profession regulations. The proposed amendments will allow persons who are entitled to practice under the naturopathic professions regulation to use the title doctor or an abbreviation DR in accordance with the regulations. Exclude naturopathic professionals from the Medical Professions Act. Replace the term naturopath with the term naturopathic doctor in the definition of a personal service established under the Public Health Act, and allow pharmacists to accept the prescription issued by a naturopathic practitioner who is entitled to prescribe a drug. The changes to Bill 32 will not come into force until the regulations have been finalized and are ready to go. And that's basically it, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions that the members may have.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. Committee, do you have any questions or comments to the Minister? Mr. Beaulieu.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the Minister if this regulation would prevent other naturopathic doctors from other jurisdictions from coming into the Northwest Territories freely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Minister Abernathy.
What does the member mean exactly?
Okay, thank you, Minister Abernathy. Mr. Beaulieu.
What I mean is people that have this distinction in other jurisdictions, like let's take Yukon, for example. People, naturopathic doctors from Whitehorse can freely go into Inuvik and practice there today. Can they continue to do that after this regulation is passed?
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Minister Abernathy.
The purpose of the regulations is obviously public safety. But an individual can go somewhere and set up shop. It doesn't mean that they'll be licensed or fall under our regulations. Obviously, we want to see anybody that comes to practice meet the terms and conditions under our regulations so that we can ensure that the person's providing safe practice. In order for them to practice here, if they want to practice under the regulations and be able to say that they're a naturopathic doctor, they'd have to meet the conditions of our regulations. So if they don't meet the terms of our conditions of our regulations, they wouldn't necessarily be able to call them themselves naturopathic doctors unless they do what they need to do to get covered under our regulations.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question would be if the person has all of the qualifications or all of the I guess skills necessary to be a doctor but doesn't live in an NWT and practices in another jurisdiction, say is coming from Edmonton, can that doctor be like a locum and then come in and set up a practice where he comes in and out of the Northwest Territories to practice? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Minister Abernathy.
If they wish to call themselves a naturopathic doctor in the Northwest Territories, they will have to meet the conditions and go through the process of getting registered as a naturopathic doctor in the Northwest Territories, which means they would have to meet the conditions that are set to be considered that under our regulations. But people could theoretically come and set themselves up, but and provide a service, but they wouldn't be able to call themselves a naturopathic doctor, not under the regulations.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. Mr. Beaulieu. Good. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When does the department intend to implement its regulations on naturopathy? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Minister Abernathy.
So there are a number of professions that we're working on, as I indicated in my opening comments. We believe that we're going to be ready to go live with the emergency medical responders in July. At that point, this legislation will essentially go live. It will essentially be proclaimed. We believe we should be ready in the fall, late fall of this year, 2019, to go live with the naturopathic doctors. Although we've done a significant amount of work on the psychologists, we believe that we'll be ready to go live with psychologists in 2020. And LPNs were the other profession we were working on, and we've recently entered into discussions with the Registered Nurses Association of the Northwest Territories to cover LPNs under their regulatory process, which means they wouldn't fall under this profession or under this legislation.
Thank you, Minister Abernathy. Mr. Blake.
Thank you. The next is, when does the department intend to implement its regulations on psychologists, first responders, and LPNs, as you just touched on? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Minister Abernathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Same answer.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. Any other questions? Okay. Any other questions from committee? Okay, committee, I believe we are now concluded with this stage of our review. Is there anyone from the general public who wish to make comments on this bill? Dr. Edwards, if you would, just let the minister step back and. Okay, just wait, just making sure the light's on there.
Gotcha.
So could you introduce yourself?
Yes.
And then go from
Hello,
there?
I'm Nicole Redverse. I'm a practicing naturopathic doctor within the Northwest Territories currently. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. My husband wasn't upset that I had to be here tonight. He got out of it. Just wanted to make a couple quick comments and help clarify on some of the questions that were done. I've been involved with the development of this legislation since the fall of 2010. It's been a long process after I received a letter from medical registries upon relocating back home to the Northwest Territories, threatening me with jail time and monetary fine for calling myself a naturopathic doctor after graduating from an accredited institution in Ontario, regulated and registered for a Doctor of Naturopathy. So as you can imagine, after 10 years of school, coming home and receiving a letter from medical registries in that regard, it sort of lit a fire under my you-know-what, to say politely. But at the same time, what's important about this legislation, which I think is key to remember, and the minister brought this up, is that regulation of any health profession is not forcing people that don't want to go to that profession to be in it. What it is protection for the public and ensuring that the public is protected when they are accessing services, no matter what that is, that it's done in a safe manner. In regards to interprovincial transfer for any practitioner, regardless of whether or not it's a medical doctor, a physiotherapist, a massage therapist, pending the regulation within that province, will determine whether or not that person is able to meet the requirements if there's no regulation. So for example, right now, if somebody is coming from Yukon and does not currently maintain an active license as a naturopathic doctor in another province, which all of us practicing in the Northwest Territories do, then they would have to prove their ability to register with the NWT licensing body to ensure that they're meeting up to the standards. It would be the same thing for a medical doctor. If you were practicing in an unlicensed province, thankfully we don't have that for the medical profession, but if that was the case, you could imagine that if there's been no oversight on a provider for 10 years with no requirements on them for continuing education or upkeep, that it would be a safety concern for that provider to then be under a regulation that includes acts such as prescription as well as ordering medical tests. Interprovincial transfer is possible from other regulated jurisdictions. There's a number of provinces in Canada that are currently regulating naturopathic doctors. So if somebody maintains an active license, then it is easy to switch over the license of a province. However, if you're living in Alberta, you still have to maintain an NWT license to be able to practice here. So you would basically have to maintain two licenses then at that point to ensure that you're meeting the requirements of that particular province or region. Aside from that, I think the acts that are being presented forward have been years of work in the making, and I'm very happy to be able to sit here on this day after almost 9 years of work, and honored to be able to bring and ensure that Northerners have freedom of choice in their healthcare and can do it in a safe manner. Having run a clinic here for a number of years, it was scary the amount of calls that we would get from providers in other countries saying, "Oh, we noticed that you don't have regulations, can we come practice there? Which is sort of an easy way door through, whether or not it was for chiropractic or for other things, which is very scary. And we have a free-for-all right now, basically, in the territories for a number of professions. So I think with the minister committing to regulating providers in the territories, it does ensure that our residents are safe. And when they do access a provider, they meet a benchline mark for education as well as training, and then obviously can upkeep those trainings as well too. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and honored to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Redworth. Is there any questions for Dr. Redworth? Yeah, seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation. Is there anybody else that wishes to speak to the committee? Okay, if there's no further comments, does the committee agree to proceed to a clause-by-clause review of Bill 22, naturopathic? Okay. Minister, can we ask you to come back to the table? Thank you, Minister Abernathy and staff. The committee agreed to conduct a clause-by-clause review of the Bill 24. Let's turn to page 1 of the bill. We will defer the title of the bill until the end. Okay. Thank you. Clause number 1. Clause number 2. Clause number 3. Clause 4.
Agreed.
To the bill as a whole, Bill 32, Naturopath Professional Statutes Amendment Act. Ms. Green.
Agreed. Mr. Chair, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that the bill in this form is labeled Bill 6. Does that matter? It's on page 6 right at the
That's
top.
our mistake, yeah. It was just a typo in our internal.
Oh, okay,
briefing note.
as long as there's
Yeah,
no legal.
the bill is, yeah, the bill itself
Okay.
is fine. Yeah. It was a briefing note that had a wrong title.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Green. Does the committee agree that Bill 32, Naturopath Professional Statutes Amendment Act is ready for consideration in committee of the whole? Ms. Green?
Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 32, Naturopathic Profession Statutes Amendment Act be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in committee of the whole.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion's in order. Motion's on the floor to the motion. Questions have been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Bill 32, Naturopath Professional Statutes Amendment Act will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration committee of the whole. Minister Abernathy, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee, and we look forward to seeing the third reading of this bill and bringing these regulations live in the fall of 2019.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you to your staff, and thank you to the public that came and showed great interest in this. At this point in time, I will close the meeting for this part, and I'll just ask committee to stay back for a few seconds, or a few